Hi, I'm Braden Molhoek. I'm a doctoral student here at ABD in the area of ethics and social theory. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about Reinhold Niebuhr's Anthropology. And you might ask, why Reinhold Niebuhr? And I would say that primarily, I think that his theological anthropology is open to and actually really needs the insights from sciences. He interprets the fall narrative in Genesis as symbolic, not literal. That gives us a chance to talk about the evolution of life as the biological history of humanity. And then ultimately, I think my goal for my career is, as an ethicist, I would like to be a virtue ethicist, but I'm Protestant. But I'm not a huge fan of some of the current Protestant virtue ethics out there. And so I think that a theological anthropology like Niebuhr's, that's informed by science and theology, could create the groundwork for a different kind of Protestant virtue ethic. And so maybe eventually someday I can flesh that out as much as I'd like to. But I feel like with the science always changing, there's more I can do. Once I finish my dissertation, I can go back and do with another layer of epigenetics or something else. And so it would be a long ongoing process. So the roadmap for tonight, we're going to talk briefly about Niebuhr's anthropology. We're going to hone in specifically on original sin and how the theology and science dialogue can inform that. We're going to talk a little bit about original righteousness. If I have time, I'll try and squeeze in a little bit about the theology and science there too. And eventually, since I'm an ethicist, the rubber's got to meet the road somewhere. How does this discussion affect the way that we approach ethics? And I'll briefly touch upon one example of that. So, Niebuhr's understanding of human nature has two aspects. The first is our desires and dispositions, what he would call the creaturely characteristics. Essentially, what it means to be biologically human. And so, in a lot of ways, the theology needs science in order to flesh out what it means to be human. And the second aspect is freedom and transcendence. Niebuhr spends a lot of time talking about the importance of self-transcendence for humans. And so I would argue that that is that spirit, but that's also in some ways mental. And I don't think you can necessarily take his understanding of freedom and self-transcendence completely out of the physical realm. And just as there are two aspects to his understanding of human nature, each aspect has its own perfection. And the perfection of the creaturely component is through the natural law. Or, since I'm going to do virtue ethics, I would recast his language into human flourishing. And I think that Niebuhr really, you could make the argument that he is doing virtue ethics, because he speaks of the natural law as a harmony of relationships between self and God, within the self, an ordered soul, and between self and the rest of creation. And the perfection of the second aspect of human nature is the theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. And I don't really have time to go into a lot of the details on this, but Niebuhr talks a lot about anxiety and how really hope and love, in some way, are really a part of faith and require faith. So to move to original sin, Niebuhr would argue that sin is not essential to human nature. Sin is not a part of what it means to be human. Nevertheless, because of the way that humans are made, sin is inevitable, and it seems like it's necessary. It seems like it's a part of who we are, but it's not. And finally, quickly, he again views the fall narrative as symbolic, and really attributes the literal reading to a lot of the problems that he finds in contemporary theology of his time, both Protestant and Catholic thought. And so, let's talk about some of the insights that science and theology might bring to this. First of all, we're going to talk about our own Bob Russell. In his book Cosmology, he talks about Augustine and Niebuhr's understanding of original sin. And he asks the question of whether or not we can find an empirical universal contingent to talk about how sin enters the world. And I'm not going to give it away, read Bob's stuff, I don't have time to go into it. But he talks about entropy and thermodynamics and makes an argument through analogy that we have both contingency and universality there. But he doesn't call it sin, because that's something different, especially for Augustine and Niebuhr. But he uses the language of prefiguring of evil. And I like that. But my background is genetics in undergrad, so I'd like to move to biology, which is great because Bob's argument is physics-based. But biology is not reducible to physics. Sure, it's constrained by physics and chemistry, but biology has its own insights to give. And so I asked the same question that Bob asks, only through biology. Can we speak of a biological contingent for original sin? And in my dissertation, I look at 3 different possibilities. I look at concupiscence, selfishness, and intergroup bias. So the first one, concupiscence, Augustine spends a lot of time picturing what human reproduction looked like in the garden. It's actually kind of entertaining to read it. But his argument is that concupiscence, or lust, is one of the punishments for original sin. And that prior to that, human sexuality was governed completely by reason. And so if we're going to take a non-literal reading of Genesis and a symbolic one, we have to ask the question, is it possible for concupiscence to predate human existence? And I think the sociobiologist would say, yes. Not even just human reproduction, but sexual reproduction takes energy. It takes resources. And there has to be a reason to get the organism to do that. And the reason is not reason. The reason would be pleasure. And so I think that it's likely that concupiscence predates modern humans. On reading about the evolution of the human orgasm, scientists are pretty stymied about biologically how we can speak of that because they can't ask other organisms how their sexual reproduction works. And so there's really a lot of different theories about the relationship between pleasure and sexual reproduction evolutionarily. And so I can't say with sufficient evidence that we have a universal contingent for original sin. Though I do think that it probably makes Niebuhr, or anybody using his perspective, more like the Pelagians than the Augustinians in this case. Because the Pelagians said that human sexuality was the same before the fall as it was after the fall. So let's turn to selfishness. We hear a lot about, in the theodicy discussion, evolution is nature in red and tooth and claw. Struggle for existence, Darwin writes about, that there's a struggle for survival, there's a finite number of resources. You look to your own interests at the expense of others. Now, interestingly, that's also the kind of language that Niebuhr uses when he talks about sin. That you turn away from what God wants, and you look to your own interests, and that often comes at the expense of others because the world is finite. And then we have in the selfish gene, Dawkins talks about cheaters and suckers, and how birds that come in and get groomed by another bird and then fly away before reciprocating, they do better because they don't have to expend the resources to groom the other bird, and don't have to spend, and are able to use that energy to do other things, such as reproduce. However, I think that as many writers want to put selfishness as a universal contingent for original sin. In fact, there are even books entitled Original Selfishness that want to talk about the doctrine of original sin as selfishness. I think it's a reductionist argument, and I think for Niebuhr, there's a better candidate, and that is intergroup bias. And so individuals look to their own interests, but groups do as well. And before intergroup bias, we have what we call intergroup preference, which is preferring the in-group to the out-group. And beyond that, a step beyond that, we have intergroup bias, where the in-group is viewed positively and the out-group is viewed negatively. Now, this wouldn't be a universal for all life, but it is, intergroup preference does exist for all primates. And there's been a question as to whether intergroup bias exists for all primates. And I'll get to that on the next slide, but for right now, intergroup preference, primates sort in-group and out-group based on biological characteristics. Now, humans, on the other hand, we sort biologically, but we also sort artificially. Sports teams, Apple versus Android, Coke versus Pepsi, you name it. We can find people who agree with us and people who disagree with us. We're really good at this. So researchers at Yale actually looked at macaque monkeys, a species of monkey, and wanted to see, okay, they should exhibit intergroup preference. They do. Now, do they exhibit intergroup bias? Well, it turns out that they do, and they measured it by looking at how long the macaques looked at a picture of another macaque. And they were able to, they spent more time looking at the ones who were in the out-group because they knew that there was something different and that there could potentially be danger. And so they actually found, they did another experiment where they shuffled in positive and negative pictures of fruit and pictures of spiders. because they're afraid of spiders, and they were actually able to prove that there is intergroup bias. That they looked longer at the things that didn't make sense, such as pictures of the in-group followed by pictures of spiders. That didn't make sense to them because the in-group was good. And so they found that they were also able to do it biologically and artificially, which was something they didn't expect to find. So that the macaques were able to actually have intergroup bias the same way that humans do. And so why I think this is more compelling for a universal contingent for Niebuhr than selfishness would be, is because a shorthand for Niebuhr in original sin is anxiety plus sin. But he also talks about responsibility and how original sin doesn't get humans off the hook in terms of moral responsibility. And I would say that you find that more closely related to intergroup bias, where you have something that's innocuous in a sense, intergroup preference, that exists and is already there, but you are still then responsible for taking that preference and making it a bias. And so my argument would be that that would be where you can find potential universal contingent for human evolution that could sort of prefigure sin in human nature. Well, sorry, sin to humans. We don't have time to go into this, but some other questions that original sin brings up in the theology and science debate. Hominid evolution. Do we think that other hominids had self-transcendence? And if they did, could they have had original sin? And I can't make a strong case for it, but I'd like to say that I do think that original sin does predate modern humans. And I think that would be completely compatible with the way that Niebuhr understands original sin and original righteousness. Because in original righteousness, again, Niebuhr says the fall is symbolic. So we can't look to the garden as a place where humans existed without sin. So we can't find perfection in the past. Where can we find it? And he says that the tradition has come to two extremes. The Protestants tended to go towards total depravity, but he feels that that does too much damage to human nature. And then the Catholic tradition, he says, introduces original justice, where God gave a supernatural gift to Adam and Eve in the garden, but after the fall, rescinded that gift. And Niebuhr says the problem with that is that what was lost or tainted in the fall wasn't something that was a part of human essential nature. It was something separate from human nature that was then given to humans and then taken back. And Niebuhr wants to make a distinction between essential nature and conforming to essential nature. Meaning that there is an essential nature for humans, but it doesn't mean that we always act that way. And the reason we don't act that way is actually our nature. It's freedom. Freedom is what allows us to look at new possibilities and to act in a way that would be contrary to our nature. So Niebuhr says that the awareness of original righteousness, he uses original righteousness and original perfection interchangeably. I don't like perfection because he makes the distinction between essential nature and conforming to nature, so I think righteousness is a better term. So he says that it's found in the law, and the memory of original righteousness is found in the law, and that, for humans, is found in our capacity for self-transcendence. And that when we self-transcend, I look back and I say, I did something wrong in this situation because I'm able to realize that other people are, or the rest of creation, are subjects and not objects only. And that comes from my ability to move beyond myself and to even see myself as subject and object. And so Niebuhr says that we have to find community in order to identify what the content of the law is, to really hammer out what the fine points are. And I want you to remember that because that's going to become important in the implications. So, like he did with with essential nature and conformity to that nature, he makes a similar distinction between memory of original righteousness and attainment of righteousness. Just because I remember there is a way that humans should be or that I should act to other organisms doesn't mean that I have that. And he says that even in self-transcendence, we make a false assumption often that we look back to the past and we see a wrong and we say, I recognize that that's wrong because I'm a better person now. I've grown and I realize that this is different. And Niebuhr says, well, no, that's a false assumption actually, because self-transcendence itself allows you to make that distinction regardless of morality. And so the question is, how does this make a difference in the way that we approach ethics? I'm going to stick with one example here, virtue ethics. And virtue ethics is a methodology is a method that's grounded in a theological anthropology. And then when Aristotle talks about virtues, he talks about a virtue as a mean between an excess and a deficiency. And we're not supposed to think of it in arithmetic means. It's not a number line with 0 and 10 and the mean being 5. Every person is actually different in terms of their constitution, and so what is the mean for me may not be the mean for Mary in any particular virtue. And it may not be right in the center, because humans have a weakness towards pleasure. Or if somebody is not courageous, then what the mean for them in order to be courageous is going to have to be more towards the courageous end than it is the cowardice end. And so I would just visualize the gold star there is the golden mean between an excess and a deficiency there. So I would say that's how classically we've thought about virtues and virtue ethics. I think we need to talk about a geometric mean, because we have the Earth there. The Earth has gravity. Now, if the Earth is either the excess or deficiency, and let's say the moon is the other, to get from the Earth to the moon is going to take a lot more energy and a lot more effort to go, say, from this point to here than it would be to go from there to there. And so I think that what the impact from the sciences gives us is that we really need to think about human nature and how that affects the way we think and the way we act, and take that into account when we're talking about what the mean is in virtue. And another thing with virtue ethics is that friendship is crucial for the acquisition of virtue. In particular, what they call complete or genuine friendship. But I would argue that Aristotle and Aquinas have a very narrow view of what that is. Aristotle would say that his view of friendship was people of similar means. Ideally, you would live together, you would share resources. Very much an in-group thing. And likewise, Aquinas said that complete friendship was only capable between Christians. And I think we need to go back to our discussion of intergroup bias, because I think that insight makes clear that we're going to have an impoverished ethic if we only make friends with and use the in-group to flesh out what the content of the law is. And so I think that really is a push from the theology and science angle to be intentional about befriending the other, finding people who disagree with us, who think differently, because it opens up the moral imagination, the new possibilities, and new ways of being. So that's all I have right now. If you want to know some other ways in which the science and theology discussion makes a difference, you'll have to wait until my dissertation comes out.
Could you provide the definition of sin and the definition of evil? Do you think evil precedes or postdates sin?
Well, given the context of my project, I can tell you what I would say Niebuhr defines sin as. Niebuhr would define sin as a breaking of the harmony. There we go. So anything that disrupts the harmony between the relationship of self and God within self. In general, he would say that typically tends to be like what Jamie was saying in terms of a turning away from God and towards yourself. And the driving force for that for Niebuhr is anxiety. And that humans in their capacity for self-transcendence know that the world is finite, there are only so many resources. We don't have faith that God is going to be able to do what needs to be done for us. And so we think we have the answer ourselves, and we go our own way. So that's how Niebuhr would define sin. Now evil, I mean, Niebuhr departs from Augustine in a lot of ways, but I think he would still be Augustinian in that way to say that evil is a privation of good. I'm not sure how that would play out in the dissertation. I haven't put a lot of direct thought into evil itself.
Thanks for using my work. I wanted to make clear the connection between Niebuhr's notion of unnecessary but inevitable and my notion of universal contingent. That's why I would use the term universal contingent for the logic of unnecessary but inevitable. Wasn't real clear.
Oh, okay. Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding would be that sin is inevitable, but not because it's there or evil, but it's for humans, it's in the way that humans have been created, and that the laws of nature are set up in a way that, in Niebuhr's language, would lead to an increase in anxiety.
Yeah.
And that it's that, and that's why original sin is anxiety plus sin. It's the anxiety is there, but it takes more than just the anxiety. Niebuhr says that anxiety can be really good. It's how civilization was built, where we problem solve great because we're anxious. But there are times where it goes further than that, or it can be destructive. And I think that's when it moves into sin. Is that? Oh, okay.